Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back here to today's edition of Intuitive Angling, and got something a little bit different today. We got the first attempt at a podcast. We've had a lot of people talking about wanting to do interviews with a podcast, so we got Connor Cunningham here. You guys may recognize him, BFL All-American champion from 2022, and Connor started fishing the Tackle Warehouse Pro Circuit last year. It's the second year on the circuit, and Connor, I just wanted to have you on. I just want to talk a little bit about how you got started and what the transition was from like the BFL weekend stuff to the pro circuit, and sort of like, I've been fishing the pro circuit forever, but I want to know like your analyzation of how, if it was up to your expectations or if it was like what you thought it was going to be. Talk a little bit about, just the reality of pro fishing today in 2024. And the thing that's really cool about Connor is he's a young guy, and he fishes old school. I mean, it's just like you're one of the best historians I have ever met in the sport. He's can tell you about guys that were fishing here at Table Rock back in 1980. Just a plethora of history of bass fishing, which is super refreshing in today's era of the forward-facing sonar and people that seem like they just don't know about the history of the sport and anything. But anyway, just tell us a little bit about how you got started here. Connor was, he was like super well known here in the Ozarks area, and he became, nationally known when he won the All-American. But up to that point, sort of how did you get started, and what was your, how the path that you took to be where you're at right now?
Yeah, so just, since day one, I grew up fishing with my dad and uncle just around here. Once a year, I get to fish a kids tournament with my uncle here, around the Ozarks, and then, from there, fish buddy tournaments. I fished buddy tournaments with one of your good friends, Rick Johnson, for a few years, learned a lot there, and then got the encouragement to go fish the BFLs. I did that for 1 year. Luckily, I was fortunate to finish second in the regional on Norfolk to qualify for the All-American, and then won the All-American and got a chance to fish the Invitationals Pro Circuit, old FLW Tour, whatever you want to call it. So that's kind of how I got to where I'm at now, and it happened quick, but man, I love the sport and cool transgression.
The thing that I want to know about, because everybody's got to go through the same thing, it's like when you start out here, even locally, because guys, here in the Ozarks, this is some of the toughest competition you're going to have anywhere as far as local anglers. It's just full of hammers here. But how, starting out in your early 20s, I mean, what allowed you to be competitive amongst all these local experts, guides and everything that fish, people that have been fishing forever? I mean, how did you make that jump from somebody that had not been fishing that long to like winning the All-American? I mean, how did that take place?
Just to talk in reverse here a little bit, the All-American, that was just a perfect storm for me. I mean, I might literally be the last person to ever win that tournament without exclusively using forward-facing sonar. So it was a perfect storm. There's fish all over the bank. I could catch them on a top water, something that feels like a really good strong suit of mine. Mm-hmm. So that was an honor to win it in that fashion, to be downright honest with you. But to back up, here regionally, I got to fish with some of the best local fishermen around here. Mm-hmm. I mean, you talk about Table Rock Lake. I got to grow up fishing with your Mike Fans, Tim Taylors, Rick Johnsons, guys like that. And then on top of that, I just have a deep passion for the sport. Whenever I was 4 or 5 years old, my parents told me I used to stand on the coffee table watching the Bass Masters on TV, flipping a jig around the living room, learn how to cast and that kind of thing. So just studying the sport from there would be, I think, where I got to maybe get lucky and hone some skills to be competitive around those arcs.
Yeah, that's easier said than done, because when when you're getting started in the sport, I mean, you don't have near the information or knowledge as a lot of these guys that you're talking about do. But I think one of the things that I have seen in fishing, it's like, it's not necessarily the experience, it's about your creativity and approaching something differently. Because when you won the All-American, you won it on a whopper plopper in June at Lake Hamilton, and that is like traditionally a boat dock lake. Guys like Jeff Coble won at fishing deep brush piles there. But it always has amazed me in the sport how people without much experience can come up and win tournaments and compete against the guys that have been around forever. I mean, that's one of the mysteries of the sport. I remember asking Rick Clunn about that, back in the early 90s. It's like, because I remember that this was about the time Kevin Van Dam started coming up, And I go, Rick, how in the world do guys like Kevin Van Dam that are 22 years old, how did they beat you? Because you've been doing this forever. And so like, he didn't really have a good answer for it at the time. But I think it's just the imagination and the creativity, trying something a lot of people wouldn't.
Absolutely. I mean, as for myself, I love making fishing lures. Like, I brought you some today that I made. I just like seeing one color on one lure and throwing it on another one, not knowing any better to do that, as sometimes is an advantage. Sometimes you get tied up with that. And, you talked about history on a lake. I think you can go too far into getting information, for instance, that tell you that, oh, a whopper plopper won't work on Lake Hamilton, whenever you just show up and you start seeing fish swimming down the bank just by paying attention and maybe not turning on every electronic in your boat and seeing, like I said, those fish swimming down the bank and saying, hey, on Lake Washita, I've seen from coverage in the past them hitting a shallow topwater style bait. Let's see if it works here. And then next thing you know, you're the only person in the field throwing it, and it works out. So.
Okay, well, here's what this is one of the reasons I wanted to have you on today. Here's what I want to know. It's like, you being such a historian in the sport and being really plugged in as far as trends and what's going on and, just all the politics around the sport. I mean, there's a lot of drama in the sport. You've been fishing the Tackle Warehouse Pro Circuit for 2 years now, which is a pro level circuit. Guys, I'm telling you right now, Tackle Warehouse Pro Circuit is more competitive than the Bassmaster Elite Series and the Bass Pro Tour. It's full of hammers out there. And, I want to know everything what you think about pro level fishing today. I mean, because you've been wanting to do this for a long time. You're very aware of the situation. What is the reality of the situation in pro fishing in 2024? Has it met your expectations? Has it disappointed you? I want to know how your mind thinks along those lines with that.
Yeah, so that's an extremely loaded question, but I love it. Like, for one, it was way more expensive than I thought it would be. So there's that. I've been fortunate with some really good sponsors, so that's helped out tremendously. And I've had some really good advice on approaching sponsors and just how to approach traveling. Now, I will say I just got back from the Invitational on the Detroit River. So going to Detroit the first time, it worked out great. I actually had a great time there. It wasn't that big of a deal, but you hear stories about how, rough it is traveling to certain places. And, whenever you add in that factor going around the first time, that's a heavy thing on your mind when you're trying to concentrate on how to catch a bass as well. Now for politics and, all that stuff, I will say you better have some really thick skin, and you better absolutely love what you're doing trying to chase down this dream. Otherwise, if you're 1 foot in, 1 foot out, there are things that come up along the way that are absolutely going to beat you down and make you just want to completely quit fishing. So those are all probably the most negative things you'll run into. You'll see some injustices out there. Everyone loves to talk about cheating and all that. I can't say in the last 2 years I've really saw anything that just my alarms went off, but you hear all that, and just that negativity in itself can drag you down too whenever you're trying to, keep the sport positive, because at the end of the day, it is fishing, it is fun. I guarantee you, if they took away tournaments, tomorrow, Randy and myself, we'd still be out there fishing somewhere in some capacity, whether it's a creek, on Table Rock Lake, wherever you go. So
yeah. Well, what is okay? One of the things that I'm curious, from somebody just starting out like this, is what is the hardest part about it? As far as I mean, I know what it is for myself, but has the hardest part for you has it been like the financial stress between having to perform? Because guys, the Tackle Warehouse is what, $5,000 or $5,500 for entry?
it's $5,000 entry.
Okay, $5,000 entry. You're going to have anywhere between $1,500 to $2,500 in expenses, depending upon how you do incidentals. Then you got all your other stuff at home you got to pay for. Talk a little bit about the stress, the financial stress that's involved about that. And I've talked about this before, about how depending upon what everybody's situation is, that financial stress can be overwhelming or non-existent. If you come from a wealthy background, non-existent. If you work for a living, it's tough. That to me, man, that has always been the number one distractor in my mind. It's like, if I didn't have any financial distractions, I can't imagine what it would be like to be able to get laser focused on just fishing. So Can you talk a little bit about that as far as that financial pressure and the
Absolutely.
reality of it to people out there that don't get it? And is it what you expected? I mean, is it before you got into it?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I've had some really good advice, and I kind of knew that maybe it might be like that down the road. I didn't think it would be on the scale that it really is whenever you get out there. I mean, towards the end of this year, it's kind of got to the point where I really need to do well in that last tournament. And knowing that, this Detroit River tournament, I knew that, hey, if I want to get a check here, I've got to buckle down. I have to catch them. And man, that is something. Unless you experience it, I can't explain it to you. It's just
It's
unexplainable.
man.
Yeah, it's crazy, and just like I said, how expensive it is. You might get a $8,000 check, and that sounds like a ton of money to someone. But after you add up the $5,000 entry, and we usually rent a house, me and a buddy, and it's anywhere from $300 to as much as $700 for the week to have a nice place to stay. So. Just that crunch on your mind while you're trying to concentrate and catch a bass is crazy. And I'll tell you another story. My first tournament was at Okeechobee in Florida last year. I finished 100th place. I had a decent first day. The second day, kind of wheels fell off a little bit. And that 20-hour ride home thinking about all the money you just spent is extreme. That is crazy.
Yeah.
So my next tournament, I drove 13 hours to Clarksville in Georgia. I was fortunate to get an 8th place finish, but we talked about fishing here. Whenever you're fishing at home, you have the complete ability to just fish for 5 bites and just try to win the tournament. Whenever you try to do that on the road, you a lot bigger risk. So Clarksville last year, my first day, I catch I think 13 pounds, come back in. The next day I make a little change. I think I caught 19 pounds by like 11 o'clock, and I was like, oh my gosh, I might get a check this time. I fired it up about 12 o'clock and come back and just fish around the ramp. The second day I go back out, catch about the same amount of fish, whatever. But then now I'm wondering, hey, if I would have not had that, pressure of, hey, if I can make it back with these fish, I'll get a $8,000 check at least. Who knows? I might have finished a lot higher than 8th place. So that's all things, unless you experience it, it's kind of hard to explain.
Yeah. One of the things that and I would be curious to know if you can do this, but one of the things that I was able to do throughout my career is even in those times when I was super crunched for money and I was under a tremendous amount of pressure to have a good tournament. Once they called you out of the slot and you put that hammer down on the throttle, I was able to block that out for the day and focus on fishing. Has that been an issue for you as far as being able to not think about that while you're fishing?
I'm 100% the same way, with the exception of that example I just gave you guys. But yeah, once the horn blows, it's like you're on the mound pitching in the World Series. You don't have the thought of, oh my gosh, I'm here right now and this is going down. You have such a love for the sport, and you're so concentrated on what you're doing from 6 o'clock till whatever you weigh in 2:30 or so. It's fishing time from there. But like I said, 20 hours driving home from Florida after not getting a check, you have a lot of time off the water to think about that. So.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the things that a great tournament angler has got to have. You've got to be able to compartmentalize. So it's like if you got stuff going on at home, problems at home or whatever, you got financial issues, every great angler I have ever met was able just to set that aside during the tournament hours and just focus on their fishing. And it is not easy. I'm telling you that. It sounds like it's easy, but it's not, because think about this. Think if you're in the middle of your season or towards the end of your season and, you're having, maybe an off year, just an average year, and that, if you don't produce in the last couple of tournaments, you may not requalify for the next year.
Exactly.
You may not be able to afford your next entry fee out there. And then, then you've got the whole thing about as the season winds down, like right now, you guys are
That's
done?
the last one.
Okay, like right now, a lot of the guys, like they've got to come up again with all the balances that are due for next year. So, is there a lot? What do you think the overall feeling about most of the guys on the circuit about that is?
Like I said earlier, you got to love the sport. Like for me, I think I was, I took some chances earlier in the year to try to win some tournaments, had some really good practices, and that landed me, I think, in 66th place going this last tournament. So I knew that to requalify in 70th, I had to do well. So luckily for me, my dad has a construction business and he's happy to have me work in between tournaments. So. That really helps a lot. So I'm super, super blessed and lucky to have family support that's behind me 100% of the way. So just that itself is huge. But yes, you're right. That thought about not requalifying, especially when you love the sport and this is what you want to do with your life, that's intense.
Yeah, I mean, you have got to have that support in order to do that, because networking is so important. It's like, it's almost impossible to show up at a tournament and not have any like group of friends you can bounce stuff off of and do well. Because I mean, looking back, you know, in all the years that I fished the tour, it's like all the guys that did well had a little close knit group of friends they could trust.
Absolutely.
Not necessarily to give them fishing information, but they may say I was up the river one day, and I could say, well, man, I went up the river today and it's blowing out, or it's muddy, or something like that, or whatever. Just generic information that saves you a lot of time. And one of the things I noticed in my evolution as fishing is, like, as you do it for decades and decades and decades, that group that you have, it gets smaller and smaller because people quit fishing, they drop by the wayside, and then eventually, after you're in it for 20 or 30 or however many years, it's very difficult to maintain that.
Yep.
And I don't know, it's just like being a professional tournament angler it's the toughest sport there is on this planet. There's no doubt in my mind.
No doubt. Some advice I was given at the beginning of this year, for example, was, you know, there's two tournaments. There's one on the water where you're trying to catch fish, and there's one off the water with, you know, promotion, social media, all that good stuff. And a good analogy I always tell my buddies about is, hey, a Major League Baseball pitcher, when he's on the mound, he's not having the distraction of having to worry about what kind of content he's going to put out. You make some really good content. I watch almost every single one of them, and how you do that, I have no idea. That's amazing. But for me to be out there and concentrate on fishing, it's a big deal to try to remember, like, hey, I need to post about this. This would be an interesting topic and all that. So you never, I guess, see that Major League Baseball pitcher worried about that. Yeah, they have endorsements and all that stuff as well, but that's not their focus like a bass fisherman. You're really trying to perform, I guess, two jobs at once to be a success in the sport, from my point of view.
Yeah. Okay, we gotta. Sorry about that, guys. The low-tech cell phone just fell off here. I had to put this back in there. So anyway, Connor, we can't have a conversation here without talking about the spotlighting. Here it is. Connor's one of the young guns out there. He's not a flat brim. He doesn't have a flat brim on. But I want to know your opinion of forward-facing sonar. You're not going to hurt my feelings, anything that you say about it. But coming from somebody like yourself you fish a lot of traditional techniques, and you have forward-facing sonar at the same. But I want to know from your perspective, from your generation, and the reality that you see our sport in right now. What is your feelings on it? What do you think is headed for the future with it?
So, just from, I guess, the ground floor here, I was late to the party of forward-facing sonar. It came out in 2018. I didn't have it on a boat till 2021. I was extremely frustrated with it when I first started using it. I've learned to like it. My problem, I guess, with forward-facing sonar is, I mentioned earlier, I've got to fish with some of, really good table rock fishermen, some of the best in my opinion. And I've got to learn from them how they, break down a lake. So one guy, for instance, he's told me a story about how back in 1975, he took a week off from work and went and threw an egg sinker around in a couple of creeks on Table Rock. And that guy can tell you where every rock pile is. He can tell you how a tree row swings across a certain pocket. And then he's also a night fisherman, so in the dark, without any GPS or anything, he can roll up on that and throw his worm through it the first time and tell you about how you're 10 feet off and you need to pick up your cast and throw in there with him to catch the fish. That is so impressive to me. The other two guys I grew up fishing with, Mike Fan, Tim Taylor, great fishermen on Table Rock, they used to wait for the lake to get low, and they would spend days going out there looking for ledges, any other forms of cover. And I mean, back in that day before all the technology, they caught a 36-pound bag on 6-pound line on a grub. And that is so impressive to me. They were able to, triangulate things, and let alone remembering where all that stuff was at, to be able to make that game day decision to catch that, huge bag, and others as well. They won tons of tournaments. Now, current day, I'm, my fishing partner now, he's a excellent bass fisherman too, but he's, grown up crappie fishing, and he's had an extraordinary career as a crappie fisherman. Won the National World Championship for crappie, all that stuff. He's a guru with electronics. I've learned a ton from him the last couple of years. So now I've seen how, 3 generations break down a lake. So then he is excellent with this, electronics, no fault to him. He's just using all possible, means of learning a lake, and he can idle through a place with side imaging, GPS it, and then live scope it. And in my opinion, he's one of the best with the live scope in the world. So I've got to see all that. Now for my year in retrospect, now that it's over, I've, had a little slower of a year. I've had some really good practices fishing old school ways. I would much rather catch them flipping a jig on 30-pound line or throwing a spinnerbait or a crankbait down the bank. And like I said, I've had some really good practices this year. The one at West Point Lake this year, I was just sure that I was going to win that thing on a spinnerbait. I mean, I caught some 5 and 6 pounders in practice, which I guess is a huge fish. And it got dominated live scoping. So after that tournament, I kind of said, hey, you need to start really, really paying attention to it. So like I said, I've had a really good teacher with the live scope, and ever since then, I think I've got 2 top 20s using the live scope exclusively. Now those are on lakes where it kind of rules out much of the old school fishing stuff. So that really helped me, I guess, make that jump. So it's kind of bittersweet to see the direction it's going with the forward facing. But if you want to be competitive now, I do think you're going to have some great opportunities to catch them old school ways, like I just said. But you better learn it whether you want to or not. And that's like I said, it's a bittersweet thing for me to see that.
Well, what was the percentage of your forward-facing fish versus traditional fish this year? Like what was the breakup in that?
I'm not sure about percentage-wise. I just know that.
I mean, out of the number of fish you caught this year, just approximately how many were forward-facing? How many were just non?
I'd say it was probably 50-50, I would say, with my better finishes coming with using it.
Yeah.
But like I said, those are also venues where, like Lake St. Clair, that was the first time there, and you want to talk about being overwhelmed for the first time going to a large body of water. I don't know how you'd ever catch one without it there. So how people did it, I studied everything I could from as far back in the 80s, watched as many YouTube on old Bassmaster stuff to see if I could find some cool old school tactic to win with. But without using it there, I don't know how you'd catch one.
Yeah, I would say that if you caught 50% traditional fishing, I'd say that's an exception to the rule, because I would say that most of the guys are up around 75%. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm just guessing.
Or more.
Or more. I mean,
yeah, or more.
Oh, okay. On the Tackle Warehouse Pro Circuit, I mean, what overall, as far as the entire field out there, how many of them are just all in on it, on forward facing? I mean, where that is their game, where they go out, put their trolling motor down, and they don't look for any patterns. They just go forward facing.
I would say 75%.
Yeah,
I would say it's a strong 75% of someone that's going out scoping. And I mentioned my team partner now that I fish local stuff with. That's what's so impressive about this individual to me is he's not one of the people that just puts the trolling motor down and just goes and says, hey, I see bass, I throw at it, I catch it with live scope. I mean, he wants to know what the fish are doing. Like, you and I have talked about flipping a lot of times, and, we've talked about Terry Thomas, which one of my biggest fishing heroes of all time, and I know yours as well. And one of the biggest things we've talked about is how he completely understood how that fish was relating in a bush or in a log or something under any kind of conditions. And that's one of the sad things about, the technology that we have nowadays is like a Garmin live scope is so effective, you probably really don't have to understand it. And that's one of the most fun things about the sport to me is try to learn what a fish does without having to visually see it on some form of electronic.
So what do you think, what do you think is going to go down with the rule changes? Because I know some rule changes are coming on this. I don't know to what extent. I mean, what do you think it's going to be over the next couple of years?
I think, just my uneducated guess, I would say they'll probably just limit transducers on the live scope. But I mean, we can talk about the Garmin live scope, but I mean, let's talk about GPS. I can't imagine like what it was like fishing without that, or even side imaging, just offshore spots. I mean, luckily I'm kind of in that, I guess, sandwich era where I still got to fish with a bunch of old school guys that would teach you how to line up, a certain brush pile or something with a street sign and a church up the hill or something crazy like that. So luckily I still know how to do that, but I think it'd be interesting to see if they completely took all that away, how much some of that 75% of the field would really struggle.
Yeah, GPS completely changed offshore fishing. I mean, they're back. A lot of you guys that watch the channel, you probably don't realize it, but prior to GPS, so I'm guessing GPS came on in the mid 90s, where it was actually functional. you only had one or two people that fished off the bank. You had guys like a lot of the Texas guys did. You know, some guys like Tommy Martin, of course, David Fritz, guys there, but nobody did it. I mean, David Fritz had every piece of offshore hard structure to himself.
Yep.
And he was a master at triangulation, which is an art, a lost form now. But like in my experience with GPS, yeah, I used it to fish effectively offshore a little bit, but for me it was more about navigation. It's like instead of like when I'm running down the lake, if I got a bite in a lay down tree on a creek 30 miles up the lake, I didn't have to have my paper map on my lap, making sure I pulled into the right creek.
Yep.
Or the right little cut. You could just run to it. So it made you a lot more efficient as far as getting from A to B and foggy conditions, all that type of stuff. But like I said, forward facing is a completely different thing. One thing here's my prediction on the forward facing, and this vibe is getting stronger, and I hear more and more about it. I am hearing there's more of a concerted effort from some of the tackle manufacturers, the big retailers, that forward facing has affected the sales on the traditional genre of bass fishing lures, that they're wanting to basically try to get it, taken out of the sport. They're maybe subsidized tournament organizations beyond the electronic companies, but I heard that it's just cutting into their bottom line so much that they can't deny it anymore. And we've talked about, all the stuff, the reasons why it should be banned, as far as we've been into all that. But I think when it comes down to it, when you're talking about, power brokers in the sport that are losing money because of it, I think that's the thing that could make a real change on it.
For sure. We just talked about expenses of the sport. Lake St. Clair, I kind of knew that it would probably be a live scoping deal. I literally could have went up there with a bag of jig heads and some minnows and fished the whole entire tournament. That's pretty much what I caught all my fish on. Now before that, I would have been on, I keep a lot of notes from, places we're going. I would have had to buy all kinds of crankbaits. I would have had to buy some, chartreuse bladed spinner baits, just all kinds of stuff to try. So I completely, see where the bait manufacturers would be coming from that standpoint.
Yeah, and it has completely changed the way that you approach practice. Because before, you'd get to a lake and you'd have to figure out some type of seasonal pattern of what was going on in relationship to the conditions that you had currently there. And it required that you cover a lot of the lake with a lot of different techniques. And that's what took so much time, is breaking down a lake and trying to establish those patterns in different parts of the lake. But now that's just not a factor. Just like you said, somebody could probably right now go out and just take a bag of forward-facing minnows and a jig head and go to any lake in the country and be competitive. If they just, that's all that they did with it. And I think that's one of the biggest turnoffs of that technology, I think, to the viewers a lot of times, and to some of the traditionalists like myself that just see fishing as a true art form. But the angler we're talking about here, guys, Terry Thomas, he's a legend here in the Ozarks, and he's the one that taught me how to flip and pitch back in the early 80s. And somebody like Terry, and if you have not been in the boat with somebody like Terry, and I know you have,
I did, it was awesome.
Terry perfected the art of shallow water bass fishing and understanding boat positioning, lure profiles, things that triggered fish to bite. And it is a science. It is the most difficult thing, because the way that Terry fished and the way he taught me to fish is like it requires a tremendous amount of time in the water. And that's one of the things that I don't like about forward facing, is it takes out that art form of it. And it just, I'm not saying there's not an art form to, reading forward facing. I'm not saying, but it doesn't take near as long to perfect that art form as it does, learning how to generate a strike off of a lay down log on a square bow crankbait based upon the size of the lure profile, the colors, the speed of retrieve, boat angle, all that type of stuff. You mentioned
Jeff Coble earlier. So in studying for the All-American I got to fish, I caught a little tidbit of him talking about how he prepared for that tournament. So, it sounds like he drove all the way from North Carolina to Lake Hamilton to, move brush piles around, plant them with the lake low. That's a ton of effort. The guy, it sounds, like it's easy, you throw a tree in the water, but everyone that's ever planted one knows that hardly any of them are ever good. So for him to know where to put them, which angle to put them at, how to hit them once the lake came up and he came back 6 months later, and which crankbait to use, that, like you said, art form is the only way to describe that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely a lost art, and I get really frustrated about it. You know how vocal I am about it, and it's like, if I know that if you haven't experienced the past, it's hard to relate to that.
Yep.
And I know that even though you're young, I know that you can, because Connor, he'll review tapes of like there's a circuit here in Missouri called Central Pro-Am. You probably watched every tape of that back since the 1980s or something like that. And that's just so refreshing to see that. But anyway, guys, I got to get ready to pick Elijah up at his jiu-jitsu lesson. What would be your final word that you could leave somebody? I mean, if somebody wanted to get into the sport, what's the best advice you can give them? Because you've effectively went from, being somebody that loves fishing to now you're fishing the pro circuit in your 20s. That's a huge accomplishment. I mean, what type of advice would you give somebody?
So the one thing that I really wish I would have known would be, how expensive it is, and the way you would combat that is, I guess, with my biggest piece of advice would be, try to find a trade that you could, work while you're fishing. So that kind of helps alleviate some of the stress of, hey, I have to get a check right now. So Missouri Welding Institute sponsored me the last 2 years. And every January I take my boat up there. I hang out at their open house where they do a scholarship, welding competition for high schools that come all over the country. And so I got to learn a lot about the trade. And, journeyman welding would be a perfect, I guess, occupation to have while you're fishing, because you can set your own schedule and, a tournament schedule for the invitations, that's 6 weeks off. But, some of these places are so foreign to you, you want to go pre-practice them. Yeah. So, you might have a job where you ask, your boss, hey, can I get an extra 3 weeks off? And, you might find yourself, training your replacement, you never know, but it's going to be more than 6 weeks. You're going to want to be able to have a job that's flexible enough where you can go pre-practice, do research, and really prepare to put your best foot forward so you can hopefully win one, or if nothing else, just re-qualify so you can stay out there and compete.
That's what I've always said, is that if you want to be a pro, you have got to position yourself. Your entire life has got to be positioned where that's the priority with it. And it's getting the time. And to me, that's always the hardest thing, and that's one of the things that separates anglers. Is some anglers, they're able to put in that time. They've set their lives up to be able to do that, and other people, it's like they can't get away from work. I remember one of the best anglers I've ever been around was my buddy Danny Crea, who finished second in the Bassmaster Classic in 1986, and Danny loved it. I mean, we roomed together for 15, 20 years. But he had to get back to work. It's like when he wasn't, he'd work up until the last second, drive to the tournament, and then bust his butt to get home to start working again. And when you have that type of pressure on you from working, it's very difficult to compete against the guys that don't.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was it Hank Parker, his famous saying was, you want to become a great fisherman, quit your job. I agree with that to some point, but I still think, unless you have a really wealthy family, I think you need to have some kind of way to generate an income where you're not, straining while you're out there trying to catch 5 bass a day.
Yeah. Okay. All right, guys. I think we're about out of time here. Just let me know what you think about it. We need to be doing more of these podcasts and talking like this. Like I said, you can follow Connor on his Facebook page, Instagram, and what else you got?
Working on a YouTube right now, but just Facebook, Instagram's where we're at now.
Okay, man. We'll appreciate.
Thanks for having me. Love it. Thanks.
Hey, see you guys later. Talk later.